the family that never mentions the alcoholic uncle, the corporation that silently agrees to ignore the CEO's corruption, the entire political apparatus built on shared, necessary fictions. The loner sees these structural hypocrisies with chilling clarity, and that sight becomes their ultimate isolation. They are psychologically allergic to the consensus reality, but the focus must shift now from the observed health of the solitary individual to the sickness of the collective participant. The cold, hard truth observed through decades of clinical practice is that we are witnessing not merely social friction, but a full-blown epidemic of neurosis. This is not hyperbole, it is a clinical diagnosis. The modern human being, especially within the hyper-synchronized Western structures, is suffering from a profound and often fatal dissociation, a forced separation from the core reality of their own seek. Look closely at the faces of those rushing through the city centers, those who have diligently followed the script laid out by the massa. They are functionally successful, often wealthy, impeccably dressed in the mandated persona of their class, yet they carry an unmistakable burden of existential exhaustion. This fatigue is not the kind that sleep can cure. It is a deep, bone-weary psychic depletion, a symptom of living a life that is fundamentally false. We are told incessantly that the path to stability and happiness lies in conformity. Secure the appropriate career, acquire the acceptable partner, maintain the prescribed opinions, and above all, never rock the social boat. The individual sacrifices their personal truth, their sombra, their difficult instincts, on the altar of collective approval. They repress the authentic urges, the inconvenient feelings, the dangerous thoughts, all in the service of maintaining that polished, impenetrable persona. They are performing psychological suicide by slow increments. The pathology begins here. The individual spends immense psychic energy not on living, but on maintaining a lie. Every interaction becomes a performance, every decision a calculation based on projected social metrics rather than internal necessity. The consequence is devastating. The repressed contents do not vanish. They merely retreat into the inconscient soul, where they gain energy and autonomy. What results is the formation of complexos autonomos, inner fragments that begin to operate independently, often directly sabotaging the conscious intentions of the ego. This is why we see the paradox of the highly successful individual suddenly crashing into a wall of debilitating anxiety or paralyzing depression. They did everything right. They climbed the ladder, acquired the status, and achieved the external validation the collective promised them. Yet, instead of fulfillment, they find a barren wasteland. Why? Because the success they achieved belonged to the persona, not to the genuine self. The soul starves while the mask feasts. The neurosis is the inevitable breakdown of this unsustainable structure. When the ego attempts to exclude too much of the fundamental human reality, the aggression, the sexuality, the desire for genuine, solido, and rest, the structure buckles. The energy that was supposed to be available for conscious living is trapped, bound up in the complexes that are fighting for recognition. The symptoms manifest as an acute sense of meaninglessness, a terrifying vacuum at the core of existence. The individual, having outsourced their internal compass to the external world, suddenly finds that the external world offers no anchor. They are adrift. They desperately double down on the collective pattern. More consumption, more social activity, more frantic pursuit of validation, only accelerating the psychic ruin. This is the tragic feedback loop of the neurotic. The sickness demands more of the poison that caused it. We observe this pattern clinically. The patient presents with generalized anxiety, but the root cause is the profound fear of facing their own internal landscape. They are terrified of the silencio, because in the silence, the voice of the repressed self, the sombra, might finally be heard. To avoid this internal confrontation, they plunge themselves back into the deafening noise of the massa, seeking temporary relief in synchronized distraction. They are running from themselves, and the collective encourages the sprint. The tragedy is that the collective itself encourages this flight from self. The social system thrives on obedient, predictable units, and the greatest threat to its stability is the individual who achieves individuasome. Therefore, the collective subtly, and sometimes overtly, pathologizes the very process of self-discovery. If you seek solido, you are deemed antisocial. If you question the collective narrative, You are labeled cynical or dangerous. If you refuse the prescribed path, you are seen as broken. This is the insidious mechanism of the collective neurosis. It creates the illness, and then it provides the false cure. It is a closed system designed for the perpetuation of unconscious control. The vast majority of people are living lives that are not their own, driven by instincts and expectations they absorbed through cultural osmosis, not conscious choice. They are puppets dancing to the strings of the inconsciente collettivo, believing they are autonomous actors. The loner, whom society scorns, provides the critical control sample in this vast psychological experiment. They are the ones who instinctively or consciously refuse the synchronization. Their initial withdrawal may have been painful, a necessary surgical detachment from the infectious crowd, but it granted them immunity. They developed the capacity for self-regulation, the ability to generate their own psychic coherence without needing the constant external fix of social approval. This psychological independence is what the synchronized massa finds terrifying. A person who genuinely does not need you cannot be controlled by you. They cannot be manipulated through the threat of exclusion, because they have already embraced the fardeau of self-reliance. When the collective system attempts to impose its judgment, you are wrong, you are strange, you are isolated. The judgment has no purchase. The loner has already paid the price of their detachment and found the internal reward to be far superior to the noise of the crowd. The rest of humanity, clinging desperately to the sinking raft of collective approval, views this independence not as strength, but as a fatal flaw. They project their own terrifying fear of solitude onto the loner, calling it pathology. But the true pathology lies in the compulsory, frantic need for constant validation. The psychological chains that bind billions to meaningless routines and relationships, fueled by anxiety, not genuine connection. The man who breaks down at 40, realizing his entire life was a performance for an audience that never truly cared, is the true casualty of this collective sickness. He sacrificed his life force to the persona, and now, the abysmo stares back. The time for observation is nearly over. The time for radical self-confrontation is now. The alternative is inevitable psychological ruin. The catastrophe of the modern human structure begins with the mechanism of the persona. We must understand this concept not as some poetic metaphor for a social mask, but as a rigid, clinically definable segment of the psyche, a specific defense structure built for interaction with the collective environment. It is the agreed-upon compromise between the individual and society. This is the role I will play, and this is the behavior you can expect. The persona is essential for navigating the world. Without some level of predictable social skin, we would be incapable of functioning in the massa. However, the psychological gravity of the situation arises when the ego, the center of consciousness, identifies fully with this external shell. This is the moment of psychological suicide, when a man believes he is his job title, his bank account, or his social standing. He has committed the fatal error of believing the map is the territory. He has traded his unique internal reality for a prefabricated suit tailored by collective expectations. The clinical consequence of this total identification is the immediate and explosive growth of the sombra. The psyche operates under a brutal law of compensation. Every unit of energy poured into making the persona brighter, cleaner, and more socially acceptable is simultaneously stored in the unconscious as its opposite. If the persona is built upon being perpetually kind, agreeable, and non-confrontational, the shadow will amass all the aggressive, critical, and chaotic instincts. These repressed contents do not simply vanish. They coalesce, gain autonomy, and become what I termed complexos autonomos. These complexos are, quite literally, splinters of the personality that have broken off and now lead a life of their own, in the darkness of the inconscient. They are emotional tumors with a relentless drive to express themselves, often erupting through projection, the mechanism by which we dump our own unacknowledged darkness onto the external world. The man who is terrified of his own aggression sees the world as perpetually hostile. The woman who represses her deep insecurity sees everyone else as arrogant and judgmental. They are not seeing reality. They are witnessing the cold, hard truth of their own unintegrated shadow dancing in the light. The fundamental danger of the persona is the absolute disconnection from internal reality. When the ego is glued to the surface, the individual becomes profoundly hollow. They are like a house with a beautifully painted front door, but no foundation and no furniture. They possess no genuine internal coherence. Their sense of worth is entirely dependent on the continuous stream of validation and approval supplied by the massa. If the applause stops, the structure collapses. This is the neurosis of modern life. Millions walking around as elaborate facades, terrified that a strong gust of reality will expose the nothingness underneath. They are trapped in a perpetual state of performance anxiety, unable to tolerate the terrifying silence of solitude, because the solidão would force them to confront the fact that they do not know who they are without their audience. This desperate need to maintain the mask explains the epidemic of toxic relationships, the frantic pursuit of status, and the compulsive adherence to collective thought patterns. People would rather endure agonizing relationships or soul-crushing careers than face the abysmo of their own internal emptiness. The true revolutionary potential of the loner lies precisely in their refusal to engage in this deadly identification. The individual who walks alone by necessity must develop an internal axis. They cannot rely on the collective mirror to tell them who they are. They are forced into a primal form of individuation, not by choice perhaps, but by the sheer circumstance of their detachment. They learn to self-regulate their seek by integrating the very contents that the massa insists must be repressed. While the group-bound individual is busy polishing their persona, the loner is forced into the arduous, dangerous task of integrating their sombra. They are confronting those aggressive instincts, those chaotic desires, those uncomfortable truths about their own nature, because they have nowhere else to project them. There is no social safety net to catch the refuse of their unconscious. This process is intensely painful. It is a conscious sacrificio of comfortable illusions, but it results in a psychological structure of formidable strength. When the collective attempts to threaten the loner with social exclusion, the threat fails because the loner has already completed the primary task of psychological survival, establishing an identity independent of external judgment. They have paid the fardo of their detachment and gained an immunity to the most pervasive form of manipulation, social anxiety. They have learned that the collective's approval is a cheap, temporary narcotic that always demands the ultimate price, the surrender of the self. The individual who cannot be threatened with exclusion is the most dangerous element to a system built on conformity. This is why the massa judges them so harshly. They must pathology the loner, labeling them as broken or antisocial, because acknowledging the loner's internal coherence would force the collective to confront its own crippling dependence. The realization that one has sacrificed one's life force to maintain a persona that is fundamentally meaningless is the moment of genuine psychological ruina, and that realization is contagious. The modern human is suffering from a massive cultural neurosis rooted in the wholesale repression of instinct and the catastrophic over-identification with the persona. We have built a society of beautiful shells filled with volatile, unintegrated shadow material. This is not sustainable. The pressure cooker of the inconsciente colectivo is building, and the explosion manifests as mass hysteria, political polarization, and the pervasive sense of meaninglessness that drives billions to seek refuge in distraction. The loner stands outside this collapsing structure, not as a victim, but as a silent, clinical observer who already knows the cold, hard truth. The cure for the collective sickness begins with the terrifying, necessary act of tearing off the mask and facing the raw, unfiltered contents of one's own seek. This is the only path to true psychological survival. All other routes lead inevitably to the breakdown of the self. The true danger to the modern individual is not the pressure exerted by the massa, though that pressure is ruinous enough. The ultimate threat is the internal landscape itself, a treacherous terrain populated by what I term the complexos autonomos. These are not metaphysical entities or fanciful demons. They are clinically observable psychological facts, fragments of the masique that have split off from the central regulating personality due to trauma, repression, or intolerable conflict. They possess a terrifying degree of autonomy, acting as independent centers of gravity, each with its own agenda, its own memory, and, critically, its own emotional charge. To understand the scale of this internal tyranny, One must abandon the comforting illusion of conscious control. Most people walk through life convinced they are the captains of their own fate, making deliberate, rational choices. This is a profound and often fatal delusion. When we observe neurotic behavior, the relentless compulsion to repeat destructive patterns, the sudden, irrational emotional outbursts, the self-sabotage that defies logic, we are witnessing the complex in action. The ego, the supposed driver of the vehicle, is merely a passenger, often gagged and blindfolded, while an autonomous fragment seized control of the steering wheel long ago. The mechanism is brutally simple. Any content that the conscious mind finds too painful, too shameful, or too contradictory to integrate, be it a traumatic memory, a repressed instinct, or an unbearable truth about the self, is violently ejected. But the psyche is a closed system. Nothing truly disappears. The ejected material does not dissipate. It coalesces into a complex. This complex then takes on a life of its own, feeding on psychic energy and asserting its will through symptoms. Consider the common complex of power, or the complex of inferiority. These structures dictate behavior with absolute authority, often directly contradicting the individual's conscious values. The man who desperately seeks validation through status and wealth is not pursuing a conscious goal. He is being driven by an autonomous fragment, a wound perhaps stemming from early humiliation that demands perpetual overcompensation. He may consciously desire peace and simplicity, but the complex compels him toward endless, exhausting conflict and accumulation. This is psychological slavery. The individual is not making choices. They are fulfilling the compulsive demands of their internal tyrants. This state of internal fragmentation is the bedrock of societal neurose. When the inner life is a battleground of warring complexes, the individual cannot achieve internal coherence. To cope with this internal chaos, the modern human resorts to the easiest, most destructive defense mechanism, projection. The complex, being an autonomous energy center, demands expression. If the individual cannot or will not acknowledge the repressed content within themselves, they are compelled to see it externally. The inner tyrant is projected onto the outer world. If I cannot tolerate my own repressed rage, I will see rage everywhere in my environment, in politics, in my neighbors, in foreign nations. The complex of my own unacknowledged sombra becomes the enemy out there. This is why the collective mind is so volatile and so prone to mass hysteria. We are not arguing about objective reality. We are engaged in a massive, synchronized projection of millions of unintegrated complexes. Everyone is pointing fingers at the external manifestation of their own internal disease. And here we return to the loner. The solitary individual, deprived of the constant social mirror, is denied the easy escape route of projection. Solitude is the crucible where the complexes reveal themselves with horrifying clarity. When you are alone, the noise of the massa ceases, and the internal voices, the tyrants, become deafening. There is no external scapegoat available to absorb the projected rage or shame. The loner is forced, often violently, to confront the raw, unadulterated contents of their own seek. This forced confrontation is the essence of psychological survival. While the collective wallows in the comforting, yet ultimately fatal delusion of external blame, the loner is undergoing the brutal process of internal reckoning. They are being given the cold, hard truth. The world is not persecuting them. Their own history, their own repressed instincts, and their own unintegrated traumas are holding them captive. This process is not pleasant. It requires a profound act of sacrificio, the sacrifice of the comforting persona and the illusion of innocence. It means sitting in the abysmo of one's own fragmentation, enduring the terror of realizing that you are not one integrated self, but a collection of autonomous sub-personalities fighting for control. It is the moment one recognizes the terrifying truth that they have been living a life commanded by ghosts of the past. The collective, by contrast, desperately avoids this confrontation. The need for constant socialization, the perpetual noise, the addiction to validation, these are all elaborate defense mechanisms designed to keep the individual running from the silence where the complexes whisper their demands. The collective agrees, unconsciously, to maintain a system where internal conflict is externalized, thus maintaining the fragile, superficial cohesion of the group, while ensuring the deeper, chronic neurose persists. The loner, having already withdrawn the psychic energy that others waste on maintaining the persona for the group, has a distinct advantage. They have begun the painful, necessary work of recognizing the boundaries of their ego and mapping the territories of their inconscient soul. They are learning to identify when they are speaking and when the complex is speaking through them. This is the first step toward true individuation, not the achievement of perfection, but the surgical integration of the autonomous fragments back into a functioning whole. To the clinical eye, the loner is not exhibiting a deficit. They are exhibiting a defense against the collective sickness. They have chosen the terrifying clarity of internal war over the anesthetizing comfort of mass delusion. They are undertaking the necessary fardeau of self-responsibility. For the rest of society, trapped in the web of synchronized behavior and external projection, the breakdown is inevitable. The complexes, when denied integration, only grow stronger. They will eventually shatter the inadequate struttura psychica of the individual, leading to a catastrophic mental breakdown, or worse, a psychological suicide where the ego surrenders entirely to the internal tyrants. The modern world is ripe with these symptoms, a massive asylum where the patients are running the institution, all screaming about the external enemy, while their own complexes hold the keys to their chains. Wake up, or be consumed by the autonomous forces you refuse to acknowledge. The true measure of the collective sickness is the desperate need to locate the source of suffering outside the self. This brings us directly to the most destructive psychological mechanism at play in modern society, the trap of projection. If the loner's great strength is their ability to self-regulate and conduct the painful work of internal integration, the great weakness of the massa is its reliance on externalization. Look closely at the neuroses that plague our institutions, our relationships, and our political discourse. They are not battles against objective reality. They are civil wars fought entirely within the mystique, the casualties of which are then conveniently stacked at someone else's doorstep. Projection is the ultimate psychological cowardice. It is the spontaneous, unconscious mechanism by which the ego jettisons unbearable contents, the repressed instincts, the moral failings, the unlived life, the very core of the sombra, and pastes them onto an external figure, group, or ideology. It is a desperate maneuver to maintain the pristine facade of the persona at all costs. Understand this surgical truth. The villain in your story is, invariably, yourself projected outward. The individual refuses to acknowledge their own capacity for malice, deceit, or incompetence. This material does not simply evaporate. It is charged with immense psychic energy. This toxic, autonomous content then finds a suitable container in the external world. The moment you declare, with absolute moral certainty, that the problem resides entirely in the other, be it a political adversary, a difficult relative, or an entire culture, you have abandoned the fardeau of self-responsibility and fallen headfirst into the abyss of projection. The sheer terror of confronting the sombra is what drives this epidemic. What we hate most in others is typically the unintegrated, rejected aspect of ourselves. The person obsessed with the corruption of others is often the one struggling most desperately with their own moral compromise. The individual who screams loudest about deceit is likely the one whose life is built upon a shaky foundation of self-deception. This is the cold, hard truth of psychological reality. The moment you point a finger, the other three are pointing back at the unacknowledged deficiencies within your own struttura psychica. The loner, having chosen solitude, is forced to sit in the crucible with their own shadow material. They cannot easily use a social group or an external enemy as a dumping ground. Their inconscient soul becomes their immediate, unavoidable battleground. This is why their early life is often marked by intense suffering and internal conflict. They are doing the hard, necessary work of separating their ego from the complexos autonomos that seek to possess it. The mass, however, has an endless supply of scapegoats. When millions of individuals refuse the painful sacrificio required for self-integration, their collective, unacknowledged sombra coagulates into a powerful, destructive force. They synchronize their neuroses. They agree unconsciously that the evil resides outside the walls of the group. This mechanism is the foundation of all witch hunts, all ideological purity tests, and all historical atrocities. It is not objective reality that drives these conflicts. It is the overwhelming, toxic pressure of repressed psychic contents seeking relief through external discharge. When the group projects, it achieves a temporary, narcotic high of moral superiority. By locating the evil in the other, the collective persona remains spotless. This is the psychological suicide of the massa. They trade the possibility of true individuation for the fleeting comfort of shared delusion. They become possessed by the very complexos autonomos they refuse to see, turning them into unwitting agents of destruction. They believe they are fighting for justice, when in reality, they are merely acting out an internal, unresolved conflict on the world stage. This is why society judges the loner as broken or antisocial. The loner is a broken mirror that reflects the collective sombra back onto the group. Their presence, their very independence, threatens the fragile consensus that the evil is outside. The loner refuses to participate in the necessary projection theater required to maintain social harmony. They see the naked truth, that the enemy is internal, and that the external battle is merely a distraction from the real war raging within the individual. Seek. You must shatter the illusion of external victimization. Stop looking for the external tyrant who is ruining your life, your career, or your nation. That tyrant is merely the externalized manifestation of your own unacknowledged weakness, your own fear, and your own repressed hostility. You are chained not by external forces, but by the complexos autonomos that you feed every time you refuse to look into the abysmo of your own nature. The path to psychological freedom, the path the loner is forced onto, requires a brutal honesty that few can tolerate. It demands the recognition that the capacity for corruption, cruelty, and moral failure resides first and foremost within you. This is the fardo of consciousness. Until you accept this terrible truth, you remain a psychological puppet, dancing to the tune of contents you refuse to own. If you continue to project your shadow, you guarantee your own ruina. You will never solve an external problem that is fundamentally internal. You will spend your life chasing phantoms, fighting external mirrors, and ensuring that the real internal battle is never fought. The result is a perpetual state of neurose, a life lived in constant psychological warfare, not against reality, but against the reflection of your own rejected self. The time for self-pity and external accusation is over. The clinical diagnosis is clear. The epidemic of neurosis that grips the modern world is a consequence of mass projection. The cure is not found in changing the world, but in the excruciating, solitary act of withdrawing the projection and integrating the sombra. You must confront the terrifying reality. The person you blame is the person you must become, or rather, the person you must integrate. Take responsibility for the darkness you carry, or that darkness will continue to govern your choices. Synchronize your behavior with the sick massa, and eventually lead to your catastrophic mental breakdown. The choice is stark. Face the self in the terrifying silencio of solitude, or be consumed by the autonomous forces you project onto the world. The hour is late. The time for awakening is now. The diagnosis of mass neurose demands a prescription far more severe than what the modern therapeutic marketplace attempts to sell. This is not about feeling better. This is about achieving psychological survival. The process is called individuation, and it is the single most dangerous and necessary undertaking a human being can attempt. It is the agonizing journey from being a mere fragment of the massa, a synchronized automaton, to becoming a unified, autonomous seek. The critical first step, the unavoidable psychological surgery, is the integration of the sombra. We must stop treating this concept as a gentle metaphor for minor character flaws. The sombra is the objective reality of your repressed potential for destruction, malice, and primal instinct. It is the cold, brutal truth that you possess the capacity for every act of cruelty, betrayal, and self-serving manipulation you currently despise and project onto others. If you refuse to face this fact, if you continue to believe you are fundamentally good while the world is fundamentally evil, you guarantee that your sombra will operate as a complexo autonomo. It will gain independence, hijack your emotional responses, and compel you toward behaviors that, ironically, mirror the very darkness you sought to deny. Repression does not destroy the sombra. It merely gives it a mind of its own, turning it into a splinter personality that orchestrates your external conflicts and ensures your internal ruina. Integration, therefore, is not a cure, in the soft sense of the word. It is the acceptance of a terrible fardo. You must consciously take ownership of your darkness. You must look into the abysmo of your own nature and acknowledge that the murderer, the liar, and the tyrant live within the structure of your own seek. Only by accepting this capacity can you gain conscious control over the instinct. When the darkness is known, it can be managed. When it is rejected, it becomes a tyrant. This is the prerequisite for psychological autonomy, the refusal to remain a psychological puppet, dancing to the tune of contents you refuse to own. This excruciating internal work necessitates a strategic separation from the collective. True individuation cannot occur within the constant noise, the unending demands, and the pervasive synchronization of the massa. The individual who has begun the work of integration must cultivate solidum, not as an escape, but as a necessary laboratory for internal coherence. The great danger for the newly awakened individual is being dragged back into the collective neurosis by social pressure, emotional blackmail, or the simple human need for belonging. To counter this, the developing individual must master the psychological defense of santa indifferenza, a strategic, clinical detachment from the collective drama. This is not a flippant apathy. It is a surgical non-participation. It is the realization that the vast majority of collective behavior is driven by fear, projection, and the desperate maintenance of flimsy, collective personas. When the massa demands that you synchronize your emotional state with its current hysteria, whether it be moral outrage, collective panic, or enthusiastic consensus, the indifferent individual holds the line. They refuse to be emotionally invested in the theater. Why is this silencio and indifference so vital? Because the collective mind, the inconsciente colectivo, operates through emotional contagion and pressure for conformity. If you allow yourself to be swept up in the group's emotional wave, you automatically surrender your critical consciousness. You become susceptible to mass suggestion and the tyranny of the complexos autonomos that govern the group. The individual who practices santa indifferenza watches the performance, recognizes the patterns of projection and repression at play, but refuses to step onto the stage. They understand that the moment they engage emotionally, they risk re-repressing their sombra and projecting it back onto the external scapegoat the group has conveniently chosen. The loner, or the individual on the path of individuation, develops an immunity to the most powerful tool of social control, the threat of exclusion. Most people are psychological slaves because they regulate their entire nervous system based on external validation. Their internal sense of worth is outsourced to the group. Tell them they are excluded, and they face a psychological collapse. But the individual who has achieved internal coherence, who has faced and integrated their sombra, finds their validation within the integrity of their own seek. They genuinely do not need the group's laughter, applause, or approval to maintain their equilibrium. This independence is precisely what makes them formidable and terrifying to the collective. They are immune to manipulation via social pressure. You cannot threaten them with exclusion if they never valued inclusion as highly as their own psychological truth. The price of this freedom is inevitable isolation. When you refuse to participate in the collective delusion, when you refuse to play the social games, maintain the absurd collective agreements, and ignore the obvious lies required for group cohesion, you become psychologically inconvenient. The massa will judge you as damaged, cold, arrogant, or mentally unsound. Accept this judgment. It is merely the group's defense mechanism against the terrifying reality that one of its members has achieved genuine autonomy. The choice before humanity is stark, and the hour is late. Continue the path of mass projection. Refuse the internal sacrificio of integrating the sombra, and you guarantee the further synchronization of your seek with the sick, neurotic massa. This path leads inevitably to catastrophic mental breakdown and collective ruina. The alternative is the painful, solitary path of individuation. It demands that you confront the abyss alone, integrate the darkness you carry, and cultivate the silencio required to hear your own internal truth above the deafening noise of the collective. This process is not a spiritual retreat. It is psychological warfare fought on the internal battlefield. Wake up. Withdraw the projection. Accept the fardo of your own darkness. Become the autonomous individual, the single, unified entity, or be consumed by the autonomous complexos that are currently driving civilization toward its psychological suicide. The time for waiting for external salvation is over. The only salvation is the excruciating, cold, hard truth found in the terrifying solidum of the self. The equation is simple, brutal, and entirely scientific. The human seek operates under immutable laws, just as rigid as thermodynamics or gravitational force. We are not dealing with morality or theology here. We are diagnosing structural failure. The modern epoch is characterized by a collective psychological necrosis, an epidemic neurose fueled by the refusal of the individual to carry the necessary fardeau of self-knowledge. This refusal presents humanity with an absolute binary choice, and the clock is running out. There is no middle ground, no compromise, and certainly no benign external savior waiting to intervene. This is the path of least resistance, the comfortable, well-worn groove of the massa. It demands nothing of the individual except obedience and the constant performance of the persona, that fragile, socially acceptable mask that keeps the terrifying contents of the inconsciente pessoal safely locked away. The core mechanism of this ruin is projeção. Because the modern individual is structurally terrified of integrating their own sombra, that repository of everything rejected, inferior, and dangerous within the self, they must expel it. They vomit their internal darkness onto the external world. They see the evil in the political opponent, the corruption in the foreign nation, the sickness in the opposing ideology. This constant externalization is the psychological laziness that breeds mass psychosis. When millions of individuals simultaneously withdraw the necessary effort to confront their own darkness, the collective atmosphere becomes toxic, saturated with unexamined hatred and fear. This repressed energy does not simply vanish. It coagulates, forming massive autonomous complexes within the inconsciente colectivo. These are the complexos autónomos that possess a will of their own, driving historical patterns of conflict, fanaticism, and self-destruction. If you choose this path, you are choosing psychological synchronization with a diseased organism. You are sacrificing your individual consciousness for the anesthetic comfort of belonging. You become a cell in a cancerous growth. Your internal life is dictated by the unconscious agreements of the group. You will make decisions that feel personal, but are merely the echo of the masses' needs. You will exchange the potential for genuine selfhood for guaranteed inclusion, leading inevitably to a catastrophic internal collapse, a psychological suicide synchronized with the collective ruina. This is not a metaphor. It is a clinical prediction based on the observation of history and the relentless mechanics of the repressed seek. The alternative is excruciating. It demands the ultimate sacrificio, the voluntary dismantling of the comfortable life built on illusion. It requires turning inward, withdrawing all projeção, and accepting the cold, hard truth that the evil you perceive outside is merely the unacknowledged shadow you carry within. This is the path of individuation, the process of becoming a single, indivisible entity. It is fought entirely in the terrain of the solidum. It requires the cultivation of silencio, not as a luxury, but as a necessary surgical environment. Only in the deep silencio, far removed from the deafening noise and demand for validation from the massa, can the individual hear the terrifying, non-negotiable voice of the self. The individual on this path must confront the abysmo. This is not a pleasant journey of self-discovery. It is a descent into the raw, instinctual, and often terrifying contents of the inconscient. You must wrestle with the complexos autónomos that have possessed you since childhood, the trauma patterns, the family neuroses, the cultural expectations that masquerade as personal convictions. You must look them in the face and integrate their energy, thereby neutralizing their power to control you. This is the fardeau the loner instinctively accepts. They develop the psychological strength to self-regulate because they recognize that seeking external validation is the ultimate act of self-betrayal. They understand that psychological independence is not a gift. It is a brutally earned state, achieved through sustained internal warfare. They accept the judgment of the massa, the labels of damaged, cold, or arrogant, because they know that these judgments are merely the collective's terrified acknowledgement of genuine autonomy. The reward is not happiness but coherence. It is the fierce, terrifying stability of the unified self. The individual who achieves individuation becomes psychologically formidable, immune to manipulation by social pressure, and capable of seeing objective reality unfiltered by collective delusion. They stop participating in the neurotic theater and become instead dangerous observers. The vast majority of humanity will choose option A. They will prioritize comfort over consciousness, illusion over truth, and collective belonging over the excruciating solidon required for self-realization. They will continue to project their internal chaos outward, guaranteeing that the structural neurosis of civilization intensifies until it reaches a catastrophic climax. But the purpose of this analysis is not to address the massa. The massa cannot hear. It is driven by instinctual synchronicity and fear. This warning is directed solely at the few, the isolated observers, the relentless analysts, the clinical minds who have already felt the cold rejection of the collective and who instinctively recoil from the smell of mass neurosis. You are the only potential antidote. Your solitary position is not a defect, it is a surgical advantage. You must accept the fardeau of your consciousness. You must withdraw your projections now. You must confront the sombra and dismantle your persona. The time for intellectual curiosity is over. This is an urgent clinical imperative. Civilization is undergoing a synchronized mental breakdown, and the only escape is through the terrifying, non-negotiable path of solidon. If you possess the internal resources, the cold, hard intellectual discipline, to face the truth of your own internal landscape, you must act. The integration of the sombra is the only mechanism that prevents the complete takeover by the complexos autonomos. Do not wait for a collective awakening. That is a fantasy for the spiritually weak. The only salvation is individual psychological revolution. If you recognize the clinical reality of this diagnosis, if the severity of the collective neurose compels you to seek true psychological autonomy and escape this synchronized descent into ruina, then you must commit to the internal sacrificio. This is the ultimate intellectual challenge. Do not merely observe the sickness. Become the terrifying, coherent structure that stands outside its contagion. This is your only chance to survive the inevitable psychological suicide of the massa.